It's just too much. Those are the words I most often hear these days. Everyone is overwhelmed. Afghanistan, Haiti, environmental collapse, COVID, it's just too much. Most conversations don't really get into any kind of exchange of feelings or information before there is a long exposition on how bad things are getting or may get. People are experiencing a sense of catastrophe and dread that seems unparalleled. Hong Kong, the ongoing violence of Boko Haram. It seems everywhere we look in the world, there is something horrific happening. The biggest problem with this is that too many of us have become fixated on this horror show in a way that is static. The fact that these things are happening sometimes is more prominent in how we catastrophize about them than about the actual issues at hand. We're sickened by the potential loss of rights and victimization of women under Taliban rule in Afghanistan, and we are enraged about local governments politicizing public health in the middle of the ongoing COVID crisis right here in the United States. And that becomes a stew of everything is horrible that colors everything we say and do and feel. We assume that the worst will happen. It's not so much that we are hopeless as we are becoming increasingly hope resistant. It's almost as if we don't want to see good come of what we are having to survive. And so, what are we supposed to do? We can't deal with it all. And this weekend, on top of everything else, we are currently facing the potential threat of a hurricane. I wonder if there may be a lesson embedded in dealing with what is most immediate that can help us face everything else. When we understand that a hurricane, regardless of its existential origins, poses a real and immediate threat to us, we have to have a strategy to deal with it. There are 3 parts of the strategy. We prepare for what may happen. We have a specific way in which we receive what happens in the moment, and we have a response to what happens. Prepare, receive, respond. This is basic to any immediate crisis that we face directly. This basic strategy is based on many things, but most importantly, it's based on how we see the world, how we may have experienced hurricanes before, how we understand the threat of weather in general, how we live, etc. We make practical choices based on our worldview, and that worldview adds up to what we call our values. I think this is what becomes so distressing for us when we feel as if the world is careening from crisis to crisis around us. We want to apply our values to how things should play out. We want to look at the hurricane of war, natural disaster, climate disaster, etc., and apply our personal values, our worldview to them all. And we can't. We feel helpless, and that leaves us feeling hopeless. I would argue, however, that it is our values that can give us a different perspective on all of it. Our values are the essential foundation and anchor that allows us not to get lost. But the first thing we have to do is resolve ourselves to some very hard truths. And the most important truth that we must face is that we indeed cannot deal with it all. We cannot, while sitting in our comfortable homes in our first world existences, single-handedly change the outcomes half a globe away. We cannot, in between expensive brunch and dinner, fix the problems wrought by earthquakes. We want to believe that we have the power to do these things, but the very real and practical answer is that no. We cannot make a damned bit of difference in the immediate challenges faced everywhere on this planet. I want to invite you back to the hurricane. Much like putting on your oxygen mask first, before helping someone else, we can affect real change by first dealing with the hurricane in our backyard. We are called in the moments that face us to rely on our values, our worldview, to guide us. Our values are what instruct us to embody kindness for our neighbors who are struggling, to require our society be more equitable and our impact on the planet less toxic. We can take our values one human interaction, one challenge, one hopeful exchange at a time into this world and set the stage for better outcomes. And our values can help us to empower those who can and do make a difference in the immediate challenges around the globe. Here is where I will offer a plug for the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee that has an entire arm of its work devoted to crisis response. They are one organization that is literally in our backyard that you can support. I'll include a link in the description below. Let me ask you though, how does your Unitarian Universalist identity prepare you, help you receive, and then respond to life? I'm not talking about parroting the 7 principles, but instead, what is it in this unique community and way of being in the world that anchors you? How does your Unitarian Universalist identity prepare you for a hurricane, a war, oppression? How does your Unitarian Universalist identity allow you to receive the realities of an extreme weather event or a threat to life or lack of access to equality? How does your Unitarian Universalist identity inform your response to a natural world gone haywire, to being confronted by a conflict of religious views, to systemic generational marginalization? We do not have to let ourselves be absorbed into the orgy of hand-wringing. Spiritual community is a strategy. What we call Unitarian Universalism is our chosen strategy to face life and to place ourselves in human existence. It is here to help us and affirm how we prepare for life, how we receive life, how we respond to life. Faith and values are strategy. Part of that strategy means that as singular, small human beings, we have to make choices about how and when we act, or we are immobilized. We have to understand who we are, what we want to stand for, and what we are ultimately capable of. And that results in our action. And yes, that action may be small on the grand scale of things. We may not be the one piloting the evacuation plane, or setting the bones of someone rescued from fallen buildings, or putting out the fires. But the small actions set the stage for the big ones to have lasting effect. There is an incredible book, Moral Leadership, Integrity, Courage, Imagination by Dr. Robert Franklin, former president of Morehouse College. In it, he quotes one of the greatest inspirations in leadership, his grandmother. She says, "Work hard, be sincere, change lives on a daily basis, and you may or may not be noticed. But never forget that your work is undeniably important. The things that people take for granted and in which they have great pride are on your shoulders. Be faithful, march forward." For me, it is this kind of thinking that sits at the heart of why a community like ours is so important. Our values can be infused in every immediate action, every response to a hurricane that we have, whether it is a true hurricane or just a summer storm. It is those small, immediate, human-scale preparations, ways we receive, and responses that add up to a changed world. I want to close by addressing one last piece of this equation. What are we to do with the knowledge that there is so much suffering happening in the world. This is the modern first world crisis. It is the reason that the news can be weaponized in our privileged spaces. And I think that's what we need to remember. Having access to the images of other people's suffering is an immense privilege. We have access to information about other ways of existing that are unparalleled. But just because we have access to the knowledge doesn't give us the privilege or the human scale capability or the right to change the outcomes. And I'm not at all saying we should turn away from suffering or disengage, quite the opposite. Instead, I'm saying that our privilege of information is just that, a privilege of information, and it is incomplete. We've got to remember that information is privilege in this world. We don't know all the suffering happening or all of the injustice in the world. And if we didn't have the privilege of information, that suffering and more would still be happening. Knowing that suffering is an ongoing part of humanity, regardless of our knowledge, is what calls on our values-driven community to be even more robust in its capacity to help us hold on to the reality of a day-to-day shared humanity. Not because we can see it, not because we can control it, and not because we can do something, but because that shared humanity is the most sacred and precious thing we have. Shared humanity is what the early colonizers and enslavers of this land ignored. And it is the sacred interconnection, indeed, it is the first form of reparations that must motivate us today. Whether or not we see it on the news, whether or not we speak the same language, whether or not we worship the same spirits, we have got to hold our humanity as one eternal bond of obligation, or we don't exist at all. As human beings, we have tremendous capacity to hold the experience of each other in our hearts. Some call it prayer. Others hold that shared consciousness through meditation, and others have other ways that defy explanation or words. One thing is clear. Without a strategy born of our values, we would be lost. But we are not lost. May it be so.